Hi, Nijay. I have been really looking forward to this conversation with you about sexual reformation in the academy.
Hi, Amy. Yeah, I've been listening to some of your talks with my friend Mike Byrd and been looking forward to this conversation a lot.
Yeah, I know. Like we have that in common. Both of us talk to Mike Bird for some
That's
reason.
right.
We're foolish enough to do that. Well, one reason why I wanted to invite you on to talk about this is just because, as a professor of New Testament theology, I find it interesting that, you've chosen to do some work in the area of women in the ministry. So I was just kind of wondering, you know, is there something in your position as a New Testament professor that has given you some different eyes to see, why this needs to be, more work spoken into it that, or what made you want to be the person to do some work on this?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with my story, and I don't know how much you know about my story, but I talk about it on
Okay.
my blog a little bit. But I grew up in Ohio, North Central Ohio, born and raised, and a proud Midwesterner.
Yeah.
And I actually grew up in a Hindu household. My parents are
Okay.
Hindu. I became a Christian through my brother in high school. My brother became a Christian through Campus Crusade for Christ. And going into college, and I went to a state school, Miami University of Ohio. I didn't know anything about theology at all. I mean, I read
Mhm.
some C.S. Lewis. In college, this was the 90s, the roaring
Okay.
90s.
Oh,
In
yeah.
college, I just keep in mind I didn't know anything about different denominations or anything. And in Campus Crusade, if you wanted to be serious about God, you read Grudem's Systematic Theology cover to cover. That was like the hardcore thing to do. And at that time, this was like the mid to late 90s, John Piper was kind of on fire. And
Yes.
so I read every Piper book I could find. I once drove 16 hours from Cincinnati, Ohio to Dallas, Texas to hear Piper speak at Dallas Seminary in
Whoa.
college. Me and a few buddies jumped in a car and drove all night. And so I didn't know there were different camps or views, or I didn't know there was an Episcopal church or a Lutheran church. I just knew that like serious Christians followed these two men. Like these were
Okay.
the people.
Yeah.
And so I did, and I ended up going to Gordon Conwell Seminary because of biblical languages. Bill Mounts was a
Hmm.
well-known figure there, and Gary Pratico, who's famous in Hebrew textbook world. And it was this kind of reformed Jonathan Edwards kind of seminary, and I had a great experience at Gordon Conwell, but it gave off the impression of just being very, very rigorous.
Okay.
And something we have in common is I have a background in the OPC.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah, so the church that I went to in my first year there was the OPC Presbyterian Church of Ipswich, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So Meredith Klein, I don't know if that name means anything
Uh-huh.
to you, but he taught a Sunday school, a legendary Sunday school on the Pentateuch there, and a
Wow.
number of professors went there, and so it was seen as like if you were really passionate about theology
Hmm.
and kind of historic Reformed theology, you went to
Yeah.
that church. And so I went to that church, and I did an internship in a PCA church. And one of my professors told me, who was also a pastor, he told me um, that I could be friends with the seminary students that were women that were in the counseling program, but not in the Master Divinity program, because
Ooh.
if they were in the Master Divinity program, they were disobeying God. And,
Okay.
again, I was very naive and I kept my distance. And I kind of just knew which buckets that I should,
Hmm.
which ones would be dangerous and which ones would be safe. And, my second year, I meet Aimee, who ends up being my wife later on in the
Hmm.
story, but she was a Master Divinity student. And,
Oh,
just
naughty.
at cafeteria conversations, I get to know her. Similar background. We both went to state school. She went to Indiana University. She was involved in Campus Crusade. She was a missionary. She loves the Bible. She loves Jesus. She's conservative in the sense that she has a high view of Scripture, high Christology, cares about missions. And I thought to myself, she doesn't seem dangerous.
Yeah.
She loved the life of the mind, but she was passionate about evangelism. And So the more I got to know her, the more I thought, maybe there's more to the story than these women are liberals
Right.
trying to pour their ideology over scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And then something interesting happened. I applied to be a TA with a professor, and he said no. And he threw my application in the recycling like you normally would. And Dr. Catherine Krager picked it up out of the recycling bin and emailed me. And for those who don't know, she's the founder of Christians for Biblical Equality.
Yeah.
And she was a professor at Gordon Conwell. And she invited me to be her TA. And
Wow.
at that point, I was still pretty on this side of
Yeah.
things. But I really wanted the experience of being a TA. So and the whispers on campus were that she's a dangerous person. She, is a rogue,
Yeah.
scholar, and she doesn't really respect, the truth of the Bible. I got to know her, and she's passed now, but she was just a wonderful person. She gave me
Mm.
opportunities no one else did, and her knowledge of Greek is, I don't know if I've met another person in my life.
Wow.
And I studied classical Greek in college. I don't know another
Wow.
person in my life that knows Greek better than she did. I did an
Huh.
independent study in patristic Greek with her, and
Nice.
she could just sight read patristic Greek without a lexicon. It's incredible. So this started me on a journey of obviously it's about the Bible, but it's also about the framework we've been taught.
Mm.
Right? I've been teaching my students more and more to think about what you're passing on when you're preaching, what framework of scripture you're passing on, to be really
Yes.
mindful of how
Yeah.
that shapes how we view things like gender, anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
church and culture. I mean, all this stuff. And I had received something that I didn't understand that what I'd received was framed in a certain way.
Yes.
I call it kind of an edifice theology. And what
Mm-hmm.
happened over seminary was not that I became liberal, but that I realized the edifice that I had received, the kind of Piper Grudem edifice, was not as solid as I had thought.
Right.
Constructed in a certain way, and I started to realize some of the pieces that's constructed on aren't necessarily exactly what they seem. So, for example, I know you've been in a million of these conversations, but like primogeniture and creation, Adam first,
Mm-hmm.
then Eve,
Yeah.
and this idea that this establishes not, they don't want to use the word superiority, but a sense of preference, priority. But then I remember reading, I think it was R.T. France, one of the kind of earlier generation of scholars arguing for widow ministry, who said, what about the pattern of scripture where there's subversion of the first,
Mm-hmm.
right? Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and
Mm-hmm.
Esau, David not even
Fills out the
being at the
first.
party to look for the king. Actually, he was out there in the field somewhere. He wasn't even, he wasn't
Right.
even in the picture. And that started me thinking, oh, geez, is there more to the story here? That we haven't thought about. So what happened over seminary was not that I just chucked one thing and started with another. It's just that it's like Jenga, and some of these
Mm.
pieces, as I read, it was
It's a good
not that
visual.
the light bulb turned on and all of a sudden I'm an egalitarian. It was more that these blocks were being taken out because they were not as crystal clear as they had seemed to
Mm-hmm.
be.
It's
And
interesting too, because like part of that framework that you're talking about that seems to be one of the challenges that you're saying made you want to look into it more is this framework that uh, there's a moral issue for women in certain spaces,
yeah,
which is their very presence, their very interaction in the academy. It's not just her mind, it's her body being there, right? It's her whole presence being there, that her
yeah,
character is then questioned, and our abilities too in some ways, right?
yeah, absolutely. I look back on seminary, and I didn't have a single professor of color. I didn't have one professor
Wow.
of color, and I'm trying to remember, but other than working with Catherine, I didn't have a female professor either, I don't think. And I didn't think anything of it. It never occurred to me that was, and it wasn't. Some people say it's another time, in history, and but there is this. Sometimes, people say there's two institutions that are slowest to change: the academy
Mm.
and the church. And I feel that. I look at what I'm doing with my students now, and I'm not perfect, and I don't pretend to be, but one thing I do with my students now is not only am I mindful of the textbooks we read, but I
Hmm.
try to interview the authors so that my students can see them.
Nice. I love that.
And because you read these books and you don't realize there's a life behind this.
Right. Make them human.
Yeah, there's a culture, there's an ethnicity, even if it's a male
Hmm.
or female, there's gender
Right.
involved, and yeah, it makes them human. And I even tell my students, email your textbook professors and thank them, and
Mm.
give them your feedback, and tell them how much you appreciated this, that, or the other. And so I'm thinking more and more
That's
about
meaningful.
how we're formed by our
Hmm.
teachers, and not just what they
Yeah.
say, but who they are.
Who they are. And so, what would you say then to your complementarian friends
Yeah.
who are going to hold some different positions than you on women in ministry? What would you say to them then about the importance of women in the academy as students, but also as professors?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the moments that kind of stuck with me as a person is when Scott McKnight, my colleague, who I'm sure you know, he talked about thinking about the issue of women in theology and ministry when he was a student in the UK. And he talks about, I think in one of his books, but he's told me the story too, of um, all these debates about whether women can be pastors. And then he's in Cambridge and he sees Morna Hooker, who's a famous professor, riding on her bicycle through Cambridge. And he thought, how many theologians and pastors, especially in the 20th century, were shaped by this giant of
Mm,
a figure? I mean, she is absolutely legendary. And no one thought twice about her being a theologian in the UK. I mean, she's spectacular, one of the greatest influences on me.
mm,
And that started me down the road of thinking about, like, we create these really clear lines of women can, like you've talked about this before, women can do this, but they can't do that. And Piper's kind of been stretched to kind of say, oh, you can read a theologian, but they can't be your direct authority, and you can learn from them, but they can't teach you about X, Y, and Z. But when you think about, hymn writers, and you think about, the songwriters of today, who often we don't even know who writes the songs that we're listening to on the radio, right?
yeah,
It's not
right.
even the artists sometimes that are writing these songs. So okay, back to your question, what would I say? Um, you know, be mindful of the prejudices that you yourself don't understand.
Mm,
And so that requires some reflection. I remember as a teacher, my first years of teaching, and a student came into my office and she says, I have a problem with you. And I said, what's going on? And she says, you never use illustrations that include women. And after that, I thought about it. I thought, I don't want to say the wrong thing.
mm,
I don't want to say the wrong thing in my illustration that will be offensive. So then I just pick, like in the classroom, I would pick someone and pick on them. So I'd say
hmm.
like, and Henry, la la la, or Bill, but I would never do that to a woman. And I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to get it wrong. But
Yeah,
I didn't realize the unintended consequences is they felt unseen.
yeah.
And so to be thinking about, really inviting women to help you better understand your engagement with them, because even at complementarian seminaries, obviously there are women there.
Uh-huh.
I live about 5 miles from Western Seminary here in Portland, and I engage with the professors there. I'm actually very good friends with several professors there, and I think sometimes I know you talk about this, but people take this Billy Graham rule to an extreme
Right.
where they don't want to be around their women
Hmm.
students for the best reasons in their own mind.
Hmm.
They don't want to be, they want to be above reproach, this and that, but then they marginalize the learning experience of those
Hmm.
students. And
Yeah.
so, for example, the number of female TAs at Gordon Conwell were maybe one, female TA,
Wow. Yeah.
right? It just was extremely uncommon because it was mostly
Mm,
male faculty. They didn't want to work with women, not because they didn't like them, but because there was this kind of fear of
right.
scandal or whatever.
Yeah. Suspicion surrounds
Yeah, but finding ways to make it
her.
work, to say, I want them to have the best experience possible. And again, I know that you know all this, but women face an uphill battle in the academic world in general. I mean, just They don't have the networks.
Yeah.
They don't have the boys clubs,
Hmm.
so just realizing they're already a couple steps down from the men in the class,
Yeah.
and the things that we're doing as professors sometimes make it worse rather than better. I think just being mindful of those things, maybe even having a sit down with female
Right.
students, in
Hmm.
public, a cafeteria or whatever, and just say, tell me about your experience in seminary.
Mm.
Tell me how I can serve you and help you have a better experience. That you lose nothing in doing that, but how many
Right.
times have we actually done that?
Yeah, I had a pastor tell me that because, and he was in the Reformed Church, and so he upheld male only leadership in the church, and yet he said that he was kind of famished in his education in the sense that he went to seminary, it was all men. All of his professors were men. Um, all of his conversations theologically were with men. All of his experiences were, kind of male in the academic world. And so then when he became a pastor and was preaching to his congregation, he says it took like 5 years in to where he realized, I'm only preaching to the men. I don't
Right.
I've not been connecting with over half of my church.
Yeah.
So I just think of how different it would be if there were more women as students, and more women as professors, and more people asking about their experiences, than to help pastors in all churches
Sure.
have, more eyes to see the different experiences.
What was helpful for me too is understanding that women and people of color like myself
Hmm.
face imposter syndrome pretty
Yes.
severely in seminary, theological education, doctoral programs, more than our white male friends. And that doesn't mean that people of color want a handout. That's not true. I don't think women
Hmm.
do either. But it does mean that I think it's really helpful when a professor affirms the research and writing gifts of a student. So, for example, when I was teaching in seminary a handful of years ago, I had a student who was very quiet. She didn't say much in class, and then I got her first papers, and they were off the charts good.
Wow.
And she was in the Master's of Spiritual Formation, which is great. But I had to sit down with her and I said, you need to do the MATS because you're better than most people at this.
Wow.
And she was like shocked because students don't sit there and compare to each other. Most of them aren't able to actually compare. How am I doing compared to the other students in the class?
Right.
I mean, she was um, incredible, just incredibly gifted, and someone had to tell her that for her to know it,
And
that
encourage her.
she's in the top 1%. I told her, you're
Mm,
in the top 1% of writers I've ever read in
that's
seminary.
fabulous.
And so we ended
Wow.
up co-editing a book together.
Oh,
I
neat.
mean, she's just that good. And it's
Yeah.
good for me as a professor because I work
Uh-huh.
with somebody that's really good. But it takes someone saying to them, like, you're really good at this. Like, you need to do this.
Yeah. This makes me think of, Nijay, like the difference between kind of like men advocating for their sisters,
Hmm.
in the academy or in the church, and women having to kind of like petition for men to speak on their behalf almost,
Right, right.
maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because I find that to be a challenging difference there that isn't seen a lot of the time. Like um, a lot a lot of the time men will think they're stepping in to help advocate for women, but they're still silencing them in so many ways, or they're making them direct towards their experience still and their priorities still, and still live within what's serving them, instead of actually empowering the female voice, and listening
Yeah.
to her ideas and her experiences. And I know, to the point to where, like, then if the woman does speak into that, um, and challenges that a little bit, then it's like, well, look at all I've done for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that, this is often talked about on social media. So one thing that's helped me is, I was talking to Preston Sprinkle a few years ago about this in relationship to people of color, and he
Hmm.
said, Preston's like, I work, I want to advocate and support people of color. I don't want to seem paternalistic. I don't want to seem like I'm using them. I don't want to seem like the poster child for supporting, people of color. So he said, what can I do? And I said, um, uh, you have to have real relationships. It can't be just
Yeah.
kind of moving around pieces on a chessboard. Like, people of color know when you're using them, and sometimes we're okay with it if it helps us. Like, we get it. Like, it's, uh, what's the difference between doing it in good faith and doing it in a sort of showy way? Because
Yeah.
uh, how many times am I asked to contribute something because I'm a person of color? Most of the time, and I get it.
Mm.
But what I mentioned to Preston was the importance of actually caring for the person,
Hmm.
and that requires a relationship. That requires a friendship.
And even in that seeking out, it's because you actually want to hear from somebody that has different experiences than you do.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you're actively seeking that, not because, oh, this is the token face, that I can
yeah,
have my face with.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's hard. Well, so I'm not an academic, but I appreciate the resources available to me from academia. And that's one thing that, was really helpful for me as a thinking woman in the church, a woman who wanted to grow theologically and be stimulated in that way and have these conversations. I found myself very lonely.
Yeah,
Um, and talking to other women and women who are in the academy. I mean, I think, that's where women go a lot then, to the academy,
of
because
course. Yeah,
they can't talk in the church.
yeah,
So it makes me think that these women have to face kind of the same challenges too in the academy. And yet, even when they get their credentials, or even like, me as an author, I've written 6 books about, and done a lot of research on the dynamics of male and female discipleship in the church. And yet you return, and these theology degrees or these books still, they can find themselves completely overlooked in the church. So, like, one question I have is, are you finding that women in the academy are able to get jobs? Where do you see them fructifying? Where do you see them being able to contribute in the church? Is there a connection that we're seeing, a trickle down
yeah.
between more women in the academy and just church life and the life of faith and obedience?
Yeah, I will say on the positive end, things are very different now than they were 30 years ago. In terms of, for example, I work with Dr. Lynn Kohick, who is provost at Northern Seminary. She's also the president of the Institute for Biblical Research. She's the author of an award-winning commentary on Ephesians with NICNT, and her accolades go on and on and on.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
She's pretty in demand as an academic speaker. She shared before some of the challenges she's facing in the academy, but just in terms of the kind of invitation she gets, the kind of gravitas she has. I think of Hebrews where it says, Abraham greeted the promise from afar. People 30 years ago could only greet from afar the kinds of academic fulfillment I think that Dr. Kohick has achieved. At the same time, I will say, I'm sure you heard the Christianity Today news of some of the things that happened there over the last, over a decade. I would say we're seeing a whole mix of things happen at once. We're seeing in some places things haven't changed in 50 years, 100 years, right? In some circles. In other
Mhm.
circles, we are seeing really amazing advances in women leadership in the academy and theological education, women as presidents of Christian colleges and seminaries, and there's a woman that's the president of SNTS, Society of New Testament Studies. It's a really big deal. It's a very prestigious academic society. But what keeps happening in the news is we still keep seeing the same problems come up of disenfranchisement and boys clubs and unfair pay and all kinds of stuff. I remember there was an old Colbert episode where he had Cornel West on. This is probably 10 years ago, and he said, "Now that racism is no longer a problem, what do you do with your time?" And as a joke, right? But it's the same thing that we can say for women in the academy is this is not a problem that is really going to go away anytime soon.
Right.
So I think to answer your question, what's happening? One of the things I'm really excited about, Aimee, and I think that you've experienced this, is having female editors at publishers.
Yes,
People don't realize the powerful role they play
they do.
in deciding who gets published, who they seek out,
Hmm.
the kinds of contracts they get,
Right.
establishing a publishing future, publishing partnerships. They're kind of the unsung heroes of academic formation because
Amen.
these editors are doing all this work with no credit.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say they're pulling the strings, but they're extremely strategic in whose voices they're putting forward. People like you, is a decision that Zonovan makes. Hey, we're going to do
Hmm.
this.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. I think that plays a much bigger effect than some of the other questions we ask about
That is such a good
women
point.
teaching, or I think those are important. I will say one thing I'm excited about is I'm involved with the Institute of Biblical Research. They have dedicated conversations, even conferences for women scholars. And I'm
Mm.
kind of jealous because they have all these regional conferences just for women. And I'm like, I really want to go to that, but I
I want to
can't.
go.
I know it's really exciting. And so what has to happen, people don't always understand what has to happen is you have to have women in leadership in order to create these opportunities. There has to
Hmm.
be money. There has to
Hmm.
be, freedom for them to go to these conferences and dream and plan.
Yep.
So that's all really exciting. In terms of trickling down, we said the academy and church is slow to change. The academy has the power of what the academy does in terms of ideas and how ideas can change things. The church is a bit of a different story.
Yeah.
And those are institutions that I think they're even harder to change.
Hmm.
But it's happening. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we're seen as kind of the liberal capital of the world. But we have a lot of conservative churches here. We have the same kind of backlash to culture that exists in other kind of more progressive cities. So then you end up having, really large conservative churches. But we are seeing, we had Lucy Pepe out here recently to talk about healthy churches, and we're starting to see change happen.
Hmm.
What we need is people in my position, people in your position, having healthy relationships with people on quote unquote both sides of the aisle. And
Yes.
I really appreciate the role you play in being a bridge builder.
Oh, thank you. And man, I have I've developed so many more questions to ask you. I want to keep talking to you. I'm sad that our time is up, but thanks so much for coming on to talk about this. And one thing I really appreciate is just being a welcome voice as a layperson,
Mhm.
to be able to have these conversations with academics, because I do think we need, you know, some bridges. The point is to reach the whole church, right? So
Yeah.
I'm happy to have these conversations. Thanks for coming on, Nijay, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope this is an encouragement for both men and women in the academy.
Thank you. And I just want to give a plug for your book. I really enjoyed reading it. And one of my favorite parts is you turn people back to scripture. That's always the best posture.
Yeah, I mean, as we're talking about these gender issues and even minority issues, it's just so important to keep our eyes focused on Christ, because that is the main thing, and what it is we all want to get together and talk about.